I am an old man who never planned to grow old by the water, but here I am in a stucco ranch on the edge of a Florida cul-de-sac, where the afternoon sun hits the pool so squarely that the surface looks like a sheet of hammered glass, and the palm fronds flicker across it like the second hand of a clock. I tell myself I wound up here because of my late wife's knees and the winters up north, and the way February could make a person doubt that spring had ever existed. But what really moved us was the promise of a simple routine. One story, no stairs, morning light in the kitchen, the murmur of the pump, as steady as breath. When you live long enough, you begin to measure your days by their repeatable parts, and mine fall into a rhythm that would bore anyone else but keeps my heart anchored. I rinse the filter basket. I wipe a faint crescent of coffee from the counter with the same dish towel I've had for years. I count out pills that change very little but reassure the doctors, and I sit at the table by the sliding door and watch the surface of the water for dragonflies that still come even in November, as if they do not recognize the calendar we invented to discipline ourselves into thinking time behaves. I speak to my wife sometimes, quietly and without embarrassment, because after 51 years together, her silence has turned from absence to weather, always there, faintly touching everything. I tell her about the neighborhood, the widow across the street who paints ceramic birds and sells them to winter people for cash, the retired contractor who insists the HOA is a conspiracy and yet still measures his grass with a carpenter's square, the way the citrus on our little tree splits open when I misjudge the watering. I tell her our son called or came by or didn't, and I try to keep the bitterness out of my voice, because it was never her fault that Michael and I were built like two mismatched hinges, always creaking in the same place, no matter how much oil you lay on. If I am honest, he got his brightness from her and my stubbornness from me, and the balance that should have carried a boy into a steady life never formed. Instead, he burns through favors, the way wind chews up a cheap umbrella, and I have been the one standing in the rain with him, holding the broken ribs, while he promises that this time he has learned. Most days are quiet enough that my hearing aids hum in my own head like cicadas, and I prefer it that way. I go to the market early when the floor is still damp from the night mopping, and the teenage baggers are too sleepy to ask if I want help to the car, and I buy things that keep well: beans, rice, flour. The bread I slice thick because old hands like a fight, and I park far from the door to remind my legs what they are for. The news on the radio keeps me company until the advertisers arrive, shouting about boats and casinos and miracle kitchens, and then I shut it off and count birds instead. I keep a notebook for small repairs and larger thoughts, and sometimes they trade pages. A loose tile shares a line with a memory of the winter. My wife broke her wrist on black ice in Ohio. A stubborn stain sits beside the echo of our first place. A thin apartment with a radiator that whistled all night like a kettle. There is a comfort in capturing problems you can solve, because the ones you cannot, grief, distance, the kind of misunderstanding that sinks roots, you just carry, and some days you barely remember that you are carrying them until a neighbor's laugh, or a smell of coconut sunscreen reminds you that the weight has a name. Michael says I baby the pool. He says this with a shrug and a grin, in the kind of charm that wins waitress and frightens bankers. And then he steps out of his shoes and goes barefoot on the hot deck as if it cannot burn him. He is 45 years old and still moves with the forward tilt of a boy who believes momentum will answer every question if he just leans hard enough. He comes with his friends on Saturdays sometimes, and with his kids when they are not with their mother, and with coolers that clatter like toolboxes, and with music that tries to act younger than it is. He almost always arrives asking to borrow something that does not sound like borrowing at first: the garage code, a folding table, an extra 50 to tip the lawn guys because he forgot his wallet. And I almost always say yes, because it feels like what a father does, and because a lifetime of being sensible has taught me that a simple no can ricochet for weeks, while a small yes may buy a little peace. When he is in a good mood, he calls me Pops and kisses my head as if I were a relic with some luck left in it. When he is tight with worry, he goes quiet and slides his eyes away from mine, and you can see the arithmetic he is doing in the tight corners of his mouth. And I pretend not to notice, because dignity is a fragile pact we make with each other, especially in families. I do not swim much anymore, not after the event 3 summers back when my chest tightened without warning, and I saw the sky turn to wet glass, and I understood, without anyone saying it, that the body is a machine with warranties no one reads. The cardiologist gave me a speech about moderation and hydration and paying attention to the way stairs make you feel. He told me the pool was not an enemy, which is the sort of medical wisdom that sounds like permission, until a night arrives when you dream that water is a mouth and you wake tasting metal. Since then, I keep to the shallow end, and I keep a long pole within reach like a staff. And if I do slide in, it is with a cautious slowness that annoys Michael and offends the boy I once was. But I do it anyway, because the boy has had his turn at bravado, and I have seen what comes next. Sometimes in the early morning, I sit at the edge with my feet in the water and feel the silt of fine dust that settles overnight, and think about all the movies that told us pools meant leisure, which must be true for someone somewhere. For me, it has become a mirror I can step into only part way, a controlled surface where I practice surrender in teaspoons. The house has the smell old houses get when no one is cooking for more than one person. A clean quiet with a hint of dust under it, not unpleasant, but insisting on its own presence. I keep the big pans because giving them away would feel like admitting something I do not want to admit. And some Sundays I roast a chicken and carve it as if I expected company, arranging pieces on plates like a rehearsal for a dinner that will probably not happen, then packing the leftovers into the freezer in labeled bags that make me look organized enough to fool myself. My wife's mixing bowls nest in a cupboard like a family that never quarrels. Her handwriting still lives on an index card for lemon bars, thin and tidy and firm, and every time I see it, I experience the small double grief of knowing the taste and knowing I no longer bake them, because the sweetness would outnumber the days I have left for walking it off. In the bedroom, I do not pretend the other side is slept in. but I keep her pillow there because it changes the shape of the bed, which changes the shape of the room, which convinces me the house still contains a story and not just a man. From time to time, an envelope arrives that makes me hold my breath. Most mail is junk, and most bills are electronic now. But there are still letters from banks with unfamiliar logos, offers that are not offers, but tests to see who is desperate enough to say yes to a shiny card that will never stop asking. Once or twice, I have found such letters tucked into the glove box of my car after Michael used it to drive a friend home, and I made a quiet show of throwing them away while he watched and pretended not to. I do not accuse him of anything, because accusation is a poor tool if you hope for closeness, and because I am old enough to know that shame makes people worse, not better. Yet it sits with me, that knowledge that money has a way of turning the ground beneath us to sand, and that certain people, maybe by temperament, maybe by bad luck, multiplied by pride, are always one tide away from losing their footing. I want to believe that the shore is wide enough for both of us, that a son who trips can reach for his father's hand without pulling him under. And on good mornings, I do believe it, because believing is cheaper than despair, and often just as practical. When the grandchildren come, which is less often than it used to be, they arrive with the impatient grace of adolescence, the girl wrapped in a hoodie like armor, even in the heat, the boy already taller than his father, and experimenting with silence, as if it were a new instrument. They smell faintly of chlorine and sugar and new sneakers, and they speak of online things that slip through my fingers like water. And I nod and smile and ask for explanations that embarrass them because they do not know how to explain what they do, not yet understand, and then we find a way to belong to one another anyway, usually with food. I teach the boy to slice an onion without looking afraid of the knife, and he does not say much, but he watches closely and tries again, and the girl softens when I ask her about the books. She is not sure she likes, because disliking a book can be a kind of love if you do it honestly. They take pictures by the pool because that is what children do now when given light and reflections. And if I end up in the frame, it is by accident. A figure in the background handling a skimmer, as if it were a wand. After they leave, I walk through the rooms they have occupied and collect the evidence. A damp towel sulking on a chair, a straw wrapper fallen under the table, a scent of shampoo so brief it almost hurts. I have been told by well-meaning people that I should travel, join a club, volunteer, take up the guitar, start dating at 78, as if romance were a sport you could train back into. And I nod because it is easier than saying that some loves are not replaced, but expanded, and that my life now has the shape of someone who built a harbor and learned the tides by living with them. The truth is that a man can be content and lonely at the same time, and it surprises me that this still surprises other people. Contentment is the chair that fits your back. Loneliness is the space beside it, and there are days when I am grateful for both, because one makes the other honest. In the evenings, I turn on the porch light even when I expect no one, and let the insects come to write their frantic alphabets in it. I have always liked the idea that light is both invitation and boundary, a way of saying, here I am, but not the whole of me. Come if you must, but understand that this is where I live. If you ask me what I fear now, I would not say death, though I think about it in the plain way a man thinks about the maintenance schedule for a machine that has served him long and well. I would say indignity, the slow theft of the right to be the narrator of your own story, the little cuts that come when people decide you are now a problem to be managed rather than a person to be met. Age invites 1,000 courtesies that feel like insults if offered without attention, voices raised as if deafness were a moral failure, explanations given to the younger companion while you stand there, holding your own name in your mouth, and I have learned to accept what helps and decline what erases me. I can still carry a bag of potting soil if you give me time. I can still change a light fixture if you let me choose the latter, and I can still decide when to open my wallet and when to keep it shut. These are not small matters. Perhaps that is why I tend the pool so carefully in a world that wants to call me fragile. I have a body of water that depends on me for clarity, and each test strip that blushes the right color is a sentence I have written in a language that answers back. It was supposed to be a harmless Sunday gathering, the kind of casual barbecue families arrange when they no longer know how to sit in silence together, but still feel obliged to preserve the appearance of connection. And I had convinced myself that if I stayed patient and agreeable, if I grilled the burgers exactly the way Michael liked them and kept the soda chest filled with enough ice to last until dusk, then perhaps the day would pass without the usual small humiliations that had begun to multiply in my life like mildew on the grout of the bathroom. I no longer bothered to scrub as often as I once had. The air was heavy with the sweetness of lighter fluid and the faint antiseptic tang of chlorine rising off the pool, and the grandchildren were darting between the deck chairs, recording each other on their phones, laughing at things I could not hear. Clearly, even with my hearing aids, their voices rising and falling like birds calling from a sky that had no need of me. Michael arrived late, of course, his shirt untucked, sunglasses perched on his head as though he were some visiting celebrity who had deigned to bless the occasion with his presence. And from the moment he stepped onto the patio, I felt that old ripple of unease that comes when you know you are expected to play the role of host, while simultaneously being treated as little more than a prop in someone else's performance. I busied myself with the grill, turning patties and brushing sauce over ribs, while Michael held court near the edge of the pool, with a beer in one hand, telling stories that I knew were only half true, but that everyone nodded at because his voice had that manic brightness that made disbelief feel like rudeness. Every so often he would clap a hand on my shoulder, as if to prove to the crowd that he was a loving son, and though the gesture was meant to look affectionate, it carried the careless weight of a shove, the sort of push you give a tired dog to make it lie down out of the way. The grandchildren laughed and called out that the old man was sweating too much, that he should jump into the pool to cool off, and I smiled weakly while shaking my head, trying to deflect the suggestion without sounding like a spoilsport, because none of them knew how the water terrified me now. None of them remembered the night in the hospital when machines clicked and beeped and my chest felt like it had been pried open by invisible hands. None of them cared that the shallow end of the pool had become for me not a place of leisure, but a thin blue boundary I approached only when absolutely necessary. The moment came with the suddenness of a joke delivered too loudly, and I will remember the shock of it longer than I will remember the words that framed it. Michael was laughing. His friends were urging him on, and I felt his palm between my shoulder blades, firm and certain, the way a man might guide a drunk companion out of a bar, except that instead of guiding me anywhere, he shoved with a quick, decisive force that toppled my balance and sent me forward, my arms pinwheeling in a pathetic gesture of resistance, my body surrendering to the gravity I had no chance of defying. I hit the water with a sound I still hear in my dreams, the dull slap of flesh against surface, the sudden roar of bubbles in my ears, the icy rush filling my nose and mouth as I thrashed like a trapped animal, panic surging faster than reason, my chest already seizing in memory of the heart attack. For a few endless seconds, I was certain this was how I would die, flailing in front of my own grandchildren, while the people I loved most looked on with amusement, and I thought of my wife, of how she would have screamed and leapt in to save me, and how her absence in that moment was as heavy as the water pressing against my lungs. When I finally surfaced, coughing and choking, clinging to the edge of the pool, with the desperation of a man holding on to the last ledge before a fall, I heard the laughter. It was not malicious in the way of enemies, but casual, careless, the laughter of people who had decided that my terror was entertainment, that my dignity was expendable in the service of a good story to tell later. Michael was doubled over, tears in his eyes from amusement, slapping his thigh and shouting that I still had some spring in me, and the children were recording it on their phones, their screens glowing like indifferent witnesses, capturing forever the image of an old man gasping and sputtering while his own son treated him as a punchline. No hand reached out to help me from the water. No voice cut through the noise to ask if I was all right. They simply stood there, a semicircle of mirth, while I dragged myself out like some drowned rat that had wandered too close to the picnic table, shivering, though the Florida air was thick with heat. I sat on the edge of a chair, my clothes dripping onto the patio stones, my body trembling not only from the cold, but from the humiliation that seemed to seep deeper than water. And I realized in that moment how completely I had been diminished in their eyes. I was no longer the man who had built a career, who had raised a family, who had buried a wife with steady hands. I was merely an old fool to be shoved for laughs, a relic whose fears were comic rather than tragic, a prop in a cruel comedy staged by his own blood. Michael clapped me on the back again, still laughing, calling me a good sport, as if the words could disguise the fact that he had stripped me of the last shreds of authority I carried in this family. I wanted to shout, to curse him, to demand an apology, but the words caught in my throat, choked off by pride and the desperate need not to let them see how broken I felt. So I smiled weakly, nodded, and excused myself to change clothes, leaving behind the sound of their laughter, echoing against the water like the cruelest kind of applause. That was the moment when the world I had built for myself, the fragile structure of dignity, patience, and routine, cracked so loudly I could hear it inside my skull. It was the moment when I understood that I was not living among family, but among spectators, and that the people I had given everything to would not hesitate to turn my deepest fear into their casual amusement. And though I did not know it yet, that shove into the pool was the beginning of a different kind of drowning, one measured not in water, but in debt, deceit, and betrayal. And the sound of my son's laughter that day would come back to haunt me long, after the water had dried from my clothes. After that day at the pool, the air in my house took on the stale odor of a party that had gone on too long and left its breath behind, a sour mix of sunscreen and laughter that clung to the aluminum frames of the sliding doors and made the pump's steady murmur sound like a machine apologizing for something it could not fix. And though I told myself to resume the routine, the coffee, the skimmer, the list of small repairs, I found my hands moving slower and my ears tuned to the kind of silence you get when you are listening for footsteps you do not want to hear. Michael texted that evening a single line that was meant to serve as both joke and absolution. "You should have seen your face, Pops." And I stared at it until the little gray bubble that promised more words appeared and then vanished, as if even his ghosts knew enough to be brief. And when I did not respond, he called to say that everyone thought I had taken it like a champ, that the video was killing online, that the comments were mostly positive if you skip the ones calling me fragile or calling him a savage. And he said this as if it were weather or sports, as if the measure of a day were how many strangers laughed at a moment you would spend the night trying not to relive. I told him plainly that it had frightened me, that the water had closed over my head in a way it hadn't since the hospital, that I would appreciate an apology. And he was quiet for a breath before he sighed the way he used to when I asked him to empty the dishwasher, a theatrical exhale of boredom and wounded pride. And he said I was making it weird, that he couldn't apologize for everyone having a good time, and that if I insisted on being dramatic, he would just keep his distance for until I cooled off, a promise that lasted less than 48 hours, because 2 days later, he arrived unannounced with the same breezy entitlement that had become his daily uniform, the sunglasses, the performative hug, the cooler he never asked to put in my freezer. And he explained in the voice of a man who has already decided, you will agree, that he needed to host a thing by the pool that weekend. Nothing major, just a few friends, music, at a reasonable volume, everyone bringing something. And he said, "we," when he meant I. And he said, "by the pool," when he meant in your house. And I listened with the careful patience of a man using both hands to hold a door, closed against a wind that might not be a storm yet, but could become one if he handled it wrong. I told him I wasn't up for company, that I was still shaky, that the association had been jumpy about noise and parking, that perhaps he could do it at his place or at one of the sports bars he liked. And he smiled in a way that made it clear he was already composing the story of my stubbornness for his audience later. And he said his apartment complex had a strict guest policy, and his friends didn't like bars now that everyone was pinching pennies. And really, Pops, what was the point of having a pool if not to use it? When I stood firm, he let the charm bleed out of his face, and the other thing come through, that cold, tight meanness that he tried to pretend was honesty. And he said that if I wanted to be alone so badly, he could make that happen. He could disappear and stop worrying about me altogether. And the phrase worrying about me was such an upside-down description of our lives that I almost laughed. And then I did something I had not done in years. I said no and left the room, a small refusal that felt like shifting a piano by myself. The weekend came anyway, not as a party, but as an occupation, with cars crowding the curb in the late afternoon and unfamiliar voices drifting through the hedges, while I stood in the kitchen and watched 3 men I had never met carry folding chairs. Around the side gate Michael had learned to open without the code, and when I stepped onto the patio and said I had not agreed to this, my son appeared with that bright, dismissive wave of the hand and a fresh beer and a soft rebuke about how I had been so stressed lately, it would be good for me to be around people. And behind him, a woman in a swimsuit called out that I was adorable and that someone should film me doing Grumpy Grandpa because it would go viral. I retreated because I understood that any direct confrontation would end with me as the villain of a story already being recorded. And I shut myself in the bedroom and felt the bass line of their music throb through the floorboards like a slow bruise, and I stared at my wife's pillow until I could breathe again. And I counted minutes the way I used to count contractions when she was in labor, except that then I had felt useful, and now I felt like drywall. When the last car left near midnight, and the deck was a glittering mess of bottle caps and dropped ice, and the pool a milky blue from whatever they had spilled, I found Michael at the edge counting bills and laughing into his phone. And when I asked if he would help clean up, he told me he had an early morning and that he would send someone as if responsibility were a courier service he could summon and dismiss. In the days that followed, the edges of his life began to fray in ways even he could not smooth with charm, and the signs arrived not as thunderclaps, but as a steady drizzle that soaked everything. Calls to my landline from numbers that began with the same 3 digits as the bank but weren't the bank. Polite voices asking to confirm that Michael still lived here because the application listed this address, envelopes with his name wedged in the stack of my mail and bearing the kind of urgent typography that knows humiliation is a better motivator than courtesy. A notice that someone had attempted to add an authorized user to a card I had not touched in years, and that the attempt had failed because, for once, some old setting had remained. Stubbornly in my favor, I did not accuse him. When I asked about these things, I simply held up the evidence and waited, and he responded with the kind of injured innocence that is a performance only the performer believes, accusing me of snooping, of spying, of assuming the worst of my own flesh and blood. And when I said quietly that the worst had been assumed for me at the edge of the pool, while I fought not to drown, he rolled his eyes and told me to stop living in the past because it was unattractive. Neighbors began to comment in the way neighbors do, half compassion and half gossip, telling me that the video had made the rounds of the local Facebook groups, that people were split between those who thought it was harmless fun and those who called it elder abuse, that someone had asked whether I needed help, and someone else had suggested minding one's own business. And I found myself shaved raw by the knowledge that my dignity was being debated by people who did not know my last name. At the grocery store, a cashier with blue hair and a nose ring giggled when I paid for my coffee and told me I was the pool guy in a tone meant to be friendly, and I smiled because the alternative was to turn to sand on the spot. That night I changed the code on the side gate, an act that felt as consequential as signing a will, and I wrote the new number on a piece of masking tape inside the garage where I would see it when I needed it, and he would not. And when Michael discovered he could not slip in as easily as before, he phoned me from the driveway with a wounded disbelief that might have been touching if it had not been so transparent, and he accused me of being paranoid, of locking him out of his own childhood. As if nostalgia were a set of keys, he switched tactics the way a river changes channels when it meets bedrock, and he began to arrive not with coolers and friends, but with a laptop and a fresh earnestness, telling me he had a plan at last, a real plan, not like the others, this one, involving a partner who had capital and a market that needed filling and a contract that was basically guaranteed if he could just bridge a short gap in the form of a small infusion. And of course he would never ask if it were not important, and of course he would pay me back with interest, and of course there was paperwork if I needed reassurance. And when I said that, my reassurance would come in the form of him managing his life inside the limits of his means. He winced as if I had struck him. He tried guilt first, reminding me of all the times a father is supposed to show up, listing baseball games and scraped knees and late-night conversations. He remembered selectively, and when that failed, he tried anger, suggesting that my money would do more good in his hands than crusting over in accounts that made me feel safe. And when that also failed, he tried fear, a quiet voice telling me that my health was precarious, that the house required more upkeep than a man my age could manage, that if I would only put the property into a structure he knew a guy could set up, a simple instrument that would unlock value and save me work, then we both could breathe easier. I listened to these pitches the way a man listens to rain test his roof, noting where the drips tried to come through, and I said no without explanation, because experience had taught me that to explain was to invite argument, and to argue was to surrender ground. What shifted from irritation to alarm was not any single plea, but the way the house began to whisper back to me with evidence he could not talk away. One morning, I found my checkbook out of its drawer and replaced with the smallest, almost tender misalignment. The kind of carelessness that only someone who believed you were not looking would permit himself. Another afternoon, the mailbox contained a sleek envelope addressed to me with a pre-approval for a line of credit I had never requested and never would, except that the income line was filled with a number that was not mine, and the phone number on the file was Michael's. The garage, where I had always kept things in the tidiness my wife admired and teased me about, developed a corner of untidy cardboard where packages addressed to a variation of my name, middle initial wrong, street abbreviated the way Michael. Abbreviated things arrived like seeds thrown by a careless hand, and when I opened one, I found promotional materials with my address listed as the registered office of a company I had not heard of, a company whose name was all consonants and bravado. I confronted him at last, not with anger, but with the weariness of a man who has picked up the same broken piece of glass too many times. And I told him the address was not his to borrow, my name not his to stencil over his debts, and he said I was overreacting, that all entrepreneurs use their parents' address at first, that it was a compliment, really a sign that he trusted me. I wish I could say the grandchildren were a refuge in this period, that they offered a way to reach him through love or shame. But adolescence has a way of making empathy optional in public and expensive in private, and they preferred to keep their distance, floating across the surface of events, like the dragonflies I watched from the kitchen table, bright and necessary and uncatchable. The girl sent me a message once that consisted only of a heart and a video of a dog attempting to climb onto a couch, and I thanked her and said I loved her and received a thumbs up that felt like a stamp, while the boy asked me whether I had ever believed a man could pull himself up by his bootstraps, or whether that was propaganda. And before I could answer, he had switched to something else, which was probably mercy. Meanwhile, the HOA sent a letter about excessive evening noise and unauthorized gatherings, and the insurance company, which in the long, polite language of actuarial caution is never truly polite, asked whether I had considered installing additional safety features given my household composition, a phrase that made me feel both counted and dismissed. If there was a moment that crystallized the first turn of the screw, it was a morning when the phone rang and a woman with an efficient voice asked to speak to me regarding a verification for a loan application. And when I said I had applied for no such thing, she said perhaps my son had done so on my behalf because he had listed himself as primary contact and caretaker. And I felt my throat tighten, not with fear, but with the particular fury that comes when someone you love begins to practice, erasing you in forms that look official. I told her calmly that I had no caretaker, that I prepared my own meals and maintained my own pool and managed my own accounts, and that any application bearing my name without my signature would be treated as a theft. And she paused long enough to make me believe that she believed me, and then she thanked me and hung up. I stood for a long time looking at the neat rows of my wife's mixing bowls and thought about how easy it is to surrender by inches, a signature at a time, a small favor at a time, a party at a time. And I knew with the clarity of a man hearing a pitch change in a motor that something larger than embarrassment was now in motion, something that would not stop just because I asked nicely. The breaking point did not arrive in a thunderclap or a slammed door, but in the muted voice of a bank employee who called me on a Tuesday morning, her tone professional and faintly apologetic, the way one speaks to a stranger whose dignity is about to be disturbed. She asked me to verify details on a pending loan application, and I felt my stomach turn cold before she even finished the sentence, because I knew with a certainty older than reason that I had not applied for anything, that the only person who would dare use my name as scaffolding for his own crumbling tower was Michael. I asked her carefully to read back the information on the file, and she did so with the detachment of someone reciting numbers that mean nothing to her. my full name spelled correctly, my date of birth, my address, but an email account I had never owned, and a phone number that was Michael's. And then she said that the signature on the form was still pending manual verification, and would I like to confirm whether it was indeed mine. I asked her to fax the document to my attorney, and when she hesitated, I told her plainly that I was the victim of attempted fraud, and that she would be complicit if she ignored it. Her voice tightened. She promised to escalate, and she hung up, leaving me staring at the silent phone as if it had just confessed to a crime. When I confronted Michael that evening, he arrived not with guilt, but with indignation, a stack of explanations already rehearsed. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, that the partner had filled out the forms and assumed he had permission, that my name was only a placeholder until his own credit was reestablished, that I should be flattered he trusted me enough to build his future on my foundation. I listened without interrupting, the way one listens to a child weaving a story about how the lamp broke by itself, and when he realized the words were falling flat, he turned to anger, accusing me of sabotaging him, of refusing to support him the way any decent father would, of clinging to money I would not live long enough to spend. He jabbed his finger toward the pool outside, lit ghostly blue in the dark, and said he might as well have let me drown that day if all I intended to do was stand in his way. The cruelty of the sentence left me momentarily mute, and in that silence he stormed out, slamming the screen door so hard the frame shook, and I sat in the kitchen with my hands pressed to the table, feeling the grain of the wood under my palms as if it were the only proof I still existed. The next morning I went to see a lawyer, a man my wife and I had once hired to update our wills, and I told him everything: the shove into the pool, the unauthorized parties, the mail in the garage, the loan application, the threats disguised as, "Please?" He listened without surprise, as though he had heard variations of this story many times, and he told me that the law could protect me if I acted decisively, but that hesitation was the enemy, that men in my position often waited too long out of love or shame and found themselves dispossessed before they realized what had happened. He advised me to secure my accounts, to remove Michael from every point of access, to consider restructuring ownership of the house so that it could not be touched by anyone, not even family, without a labyrinth of legal resistance. His words were steady, practical, but beneath them I heard the grim music of inevitability. My son had become not just a burden, but a danger, and love could no longer serve as an excuse for inaction. I signed documents that day with a hand that trembled only slightly, each signature feeling like both betrayal and rescue, a confession that the boy I had raised was gone, and a vow to the man I still was that I would not be erased without a fight. When I returned home, the pool looked different to me, not like water waiting to betray me, but like a mirror showing me the truth I had refused to see. I sat at its edge, feet dangling in the cool, and I realized that the real drowning had already begun long before Michael shoved me, that I had been sinking inch by inch into the quicksand of his need, his charm, his promises, his failures, until I could barely recognize the shoreline of my own life. The middle of the story was here, not at the beginning, and not yet at the end, But in this suspended moment where everything tilted, where I could choose to sink further or to claw my way out, for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something stronger than fear or humiliation. I felt resolve, bitter and hard, the kind that comes when you finally understand that survival is not selfishness, that saying no is not cruelty, that love does not require self-destruction. The sky above me was streaked with the pink of early evening, the kind of sky my wife used to call a painting too obvious to be real. And I whispered to her that I was sorry it had come to this, but that I would not let her house, her memory, her husband be dragged under by a son who had forgotten the difference between trust and theft. It was in that moment, with my reflection trembling on the surface of the pool, that I knew the war had truly begun. The days after the lawyers visited unfolded with a strange, pressurized clarity, as if the air itself had thickened, and every sound in the house arrived with its own small echo, and I moved through my rooms with the awareness of a man who has stopped, pretending the storm is only wind, and begun tying down what can be tied, changing the passwords, whose dates still carried my wife's birthday like an old superstition, calling banks and utilities and the county clerk with the slow, stubborn politeness of someone who refuses to be hurried out of his own life, while outside the pool stared back at me with that indifferent blue, a sheet of water that had watched all of this before and would go on watching it after, unbothered by names or signatures. Michael sensed a shift before I said a word, the way a boy senses a teacher has moved from warnings to consequences, and he adjusted his performance accordingly, arriving alone and unshaven and regretful, the bravado dialed down and the sleeves pushed up, saying he had made mistakes and he could fix them if I would just back him long enough to get over the hump, because that was all this was, a hump, and he had a plan for the new quarter, and a contact who had responded to his deck, and a vendor who was late paying but would come through. And as he spoke, the varnish cracked, and I glimpsed what sat beneath the pitch. Calls from a soft collections team that no longer sounded soft, a sports betting account that had blown past the tolerance of even algorithms designed to keep hope alive, a tangle of quick-turn bridge loans with rates that would make a preacher swear, and a car title that wasn't quite a title anymore because he had sold the equity in it twice, which is a trick you can do only once if you want to keep breathing easily. He tried to make the problem beautiful, to drape it in the fabric of sacrifice by claiming it was all for the kids, that Hazel's tuition had spiked and the boy needed a laptop, and the rent had doubled because Florida was a paradise only for landlords, and he kept pronouncing the word family like a magic phrase that ought to open every lock. And when I did not hand him a key, he told me very quietly that he had used my address for a couple of applications because his own mailbox had become a liability, which was how the envelopes had wandered into my life, and why the repo truck had idled at the curb that morning, eyeing my sedan as if it owed somebody an apology. I stood at the kitchen counter with the phone to my ear and learned the particular humiliation of explaining to a man with a clipboard that the person he wanted was my son, not me, and that the car in the driveway had been bought outright 10 years ago and would not be moving today or any other day without my consent. And somewhere in the pause on the other end of the line, I heard a tired sympathy that did nothing to ease the burning in my chest, because sympathy is a bandage you apply after your skin has been taken. The escalation did not arrive as one event, but as a sequence of smaller cuts that refused to close. And the second week brought a welfare check from a pair of officers with polite smiles and rigid clipboards who knocked on my door at dinner time to ask whether I was all right, whether anyone was mistreating me, whether I had access to food and medication, because someone had called with concerns about possible cognitive decline. And while I knew exactly who that someone was, I kept my voice steady and walked them through my pantry and my pill organizer and my little notebook by the sliding door where I tracked the chlorine levels. And I made a joke about confusing pH and PhD that landed gently enough to allow them to smile, and then I watched through the peephole as they wrote something down and left, leaving me with the realization that Michael had opened another front in this quiet war, one where forms and opinions might be used to reclassify me from person to problem, from citizen to case. The next day, the pharmacy called to say my automatic refill had been canceled at my request, and I spent 30 minutes in the lobby explaining to a young man whose hair looked like a question mark that my request was a fiction and my blood pressure was not. And by the time the label spat from the machine like a grudging concession, I felt older by a year. Because humiliation must be made public to do its fullest work, the pool video found a second life on Michael's channel, which I did not know he had until neighbors began to ask, kindly, foolishly, sincerely, whether I was okay with being content. And then a woman who walks her dog past my house every evening leaned over the hedge to say she hoped the comments did not get me down because internet people were cruel. And I nodded as if I had read them, when in fact I had not, having recognized long ago that there are insults you do not need to hear because you already know the words by heart. What I did see, because it was heated into my face at the grocery store checkout, was a frozen frame of myself sprawling into water, while a caption in bright letters squealed about pranking Dad, and I stood there, holding a loaf of bread I did not need, while the teenage cashier cleared her throat and pretended the world had not become a place where even my fear could be monetized for pennies. When the collectors shifted from verification to resolution, their voices changed the way a tenor turns to a baritone when the song requires a deeper note. And one of them left a message at 2 a.m. in which he said he knew where I lived, and there were ways to make this simple. And though I knew he meant only the simple brutality of signatures and liens and wage garnishments that cannot touch the retired, something in the sentence scraped my nerves raw, so I printed it and took it to my lawyer, who raised his eyebrows and told me it was useful in the ugly way. Evidence is useful. And then he slid a new stack of paper across the desk and talked me through a living trust with a voice like a mechanic diagnosing a failing. Transmission, patient, and precise. And I signed with the understanding that compassion and caution are not antonyms when you are dealing with your own child. We changed the deed and the beneficiaries and the access on every account that had ever known Michael's name. We added a durable power of attorney that pointed not to him, but to a woman at the firm who carried faithfulness in her posture. We filed a trespass affidavit with the sheriff that would allow a deputy to tell my son, if it came to that the past tense of welcome is no. The small thefts announce themselves like coughs before an illness declares itself, and one afternoon reached for my wife's watch, the slim gold-faced piece I keep in a velvet box, as if the softness could keep time from reaching it, and found an empty nest where it should have lain, which was how I learned that doors do not keep out those who already know what you treasure, and a pawn ticket in Michael's name answered the question of where it had gone with the sort of honesty that money enforces. I went to the shop with a calm I did not feel and redeemed what I could of my marriage from a glass case that smelled faintly of oil and despair, and the man behind the counter, who had eyes like someone who sleeps under a fluorescent light, slid me a photocopy of the intake form without being asked, because laws about proof of ownership and the rights of the wronged scrambled into place when an old man shows up with a tremor in his hand and a story he barely disguises as a hypothesis. I held the paper later at my kitchen table and thought of my wife's wrist, the way she used to check the time in church by the movement of her sleeve, and I said aloud that I would forgive almost anything but this, not because the watch had monetary value, it did and it didn't, but because it was the sort of theft that says the person you are stealing from has been reduced to inventory. In those weeks, I discovered that rage at my age is not a bonfire, but a kiln, steady and controlled, hardening what it is aimed at into something that will not break. And I fired myself in it each morning as I called another institution to repeat the same litany of protections, and I recorded every conversation with the mechanical civility of a man washing knives he no longer intends to leave in a drawer. I installed cameras not because I believed in surveillance, but because I had learned that memory, mine, his, theirs, could be denied, and a memory with a timestamp is a different kind of witness. The first night after the system went live, I watched Michael on my phone, a grainy figure in the blue light, trying the gate, and then the side door, and then the garage, and I listened to the soft, agitated monologue he delivered to himself as he failed at each step, a prayer or a curse or both, and I felt something like grief telescope and sharpen into resolve. He would not walk in here again as if my home were a staging area for his next idea. I had thought the grandchildren might be a bridge, or at least a buffer. But when Hazel came by, with her chin tucked into her hoodie, and asked with a hesitant brightness whether I had really gone full legal on her dad, I understood that Michael had adjusted his narrative for their benefit, recasting me as a vindictive relic guarding treasure I could not spend, and I chose my words with the care of a surgeon who knows a slip will cost blood, telling her that I loved her father, but would not be used by him, that I loved her and her brother, but would not be baited with them, and that boundary and love are not opposites when a man is drowning, because sometimes the rope is the refusal. And she nodded without understanding and left a half-eaten muffin on the counter as if to prove she had been there. The boy sent me a text that said only, "You good?" which in his language was the equivalent of a visit. And I answered, "I am trying to be." which in mine meant I was still here. Michael's last honest attempt at persuasion came one humid night after midnight when he knocked rather than pounded and stood on the stoop with his hands empty and his eyes red and asked me to hear him out because he had no one else left to ask, and I let him speak through the screen while the porch light drew a frantic halo of moths. And he told me that a man named Victor, not that kind of guy, Pops, he just fronts for people who can't get banks to move fast, had advanced him more than he could repay, and that Victor's patience had evaporated on the same afternoon. 3 new videos on the channel failed to hit their targets, and that mistakes had been made, sure, but the thing about mistakes was you could fix them if someone loved you enough to give you one last lever. And he stood there with his shoulders slumped and his voice cracked, and I remembered him at 6 with a scraped knee and the same quiver in his mouth, and I hated him for making me see the boy in the man he had become. I told him through the mesh that I could give him the name of a counselor and a card for a local meeting and the phone number of a lawyer who knew how to talk to men like Victor, but that I would not give him money, not now, not in any configuration, not even if the refusal burned a hole through both of us. And he stared at me a long time and said very gently that sometimes bad things happen to people who say no. And I said very gently that sometimes worse things happen to people who say yes. And he turned and walked away without slamming anything, which was somehow crueler than the alternative. 2 days later, someone threw a handful of river rocks against the pool screen around midnight, not enough to tear it, but enough to sound like gunfire in the quiet. And when I went out with the flashlight, the beam caught a rectangle of paper pinned under a rock on the patio table, a note with block letters advising me to help your boy or he drowns. And there was an absence in the sentence where the rest of the threat belonged that made my knees feel hollow, because the writer understood what was required and what was not. I took the note inside and slid it into a plastic bag like a detective in a show and drove it to the sheriff's office the next morning, where a deputy with the posture of a man who has carried many old men's fears out to their cars told me they would increase patrols and that if I felt unsafe, I should consider staying with family. And I said I was doing exactly that by sitting in my own kitchen. The second escalation then was not a single rise, but a set of stairs I was forced to climb in the dark, feeling for the next tread with my toes, while a voice below me alternated between pleading and promising, and each step took something and gave something back. It took the illusion that love can excuse anything, and it gave the knowledge that love, to be love, sometimes refuses. It took the comfortable lie that my son's debts were storms that would pass over me if I stayed very still, and it gave the uncomfortable truth that his drowning would drag me under unless I learned to swim for myself. By the time I reached what passed for a landing, a trust filed, a camera blinking quietly in the eaves, a folder of documents labeled in my careful hand, a circle of neighbors who knew they could call me at any hour, a sheriff's deputy who knew my gate code and my name. I understood that the next time Michael tried to use my life as collateral, the conversation would no longer be private or polite, and that understanding was both a sorrow and a weapon I had never wanted to carry. I chose the evening because that was when the pool remembered me best, the water darkening to a heavy blue that showed the sky's last light like a bruise, and the pump whispering the kind of lullaby men sing to themselves when they are trying not to be afraid, and I set the table inside with everything that had replaced superstition in my life. The living trust binder tabbed in bright colors by the paralegal, copies of the trespass affidavit signed by the sheriff, a letter my lawyer had drafted that removed Michael from every conceivable access point to my money or my house. And beside those papers, the thin gold watch I had retrieved from the pawn shop, its face wiped clean, placed not as bait, but as a reminder to myself that there were still things I would not surrender. And then I made tea and waited with the porch light on and the side gate locked and the camera apps open on my phone, calm the way a man is calm when he has finally accepted that hope has to sit down and let consequence do the talking. Michael had texted an hour earlier with the false humility of a man asking for a meeting he intends to control, saying he just needed 15 minutes, that he wanted to clear the air, that he could not sleep with all this between us. And I answered that he could come by at 8 and that we would speak on the patio because I preferred air I could see. And then I called my neighbor Ruth to remind her of the plan, and she said she would be on her porch with her reading lamp on and her phone charged, which is the kind of friendship you can still build in this country if you water it every week and lend each other tools. He came at 8 on the dot with another man walking half a step behind him, a man in a linen shirt unbuttoned too far, and a chain that made a quiet metallic sound when he moved, a man who did not introduce himself and did not need to, because everything about him had been designed to be read rather than heard. And I felt the little elevator inside my chest drop one floor and then stop, because I had known, of course, that he would not come alone, because men who owe money rarely arrive without witnesses to their urgency, and the calculus was simple. They wanted signatures, mine, here, now, on documents that would turn the deed into leverage, and the leverage into cash, into a night without threats. I did not step back. I opened the screen, left it between us like a confession booth, and told Michael that we would talk outside and that his friend could wait by the rail. And when the man smiled in the way people smile when they are remembering either a joke or an address, I added that the conversation would be recorded and that a deputy would be along soon for a courtesy visit, a phrase my lawyer had taught me that sounds light until you notice the steel in it. Michael tried to lead with charm and failed quickly, then tried with fatigue, and that got him to the chair, and he began the familiar litany about mistakes, about being behind, about a deal that would break open if he could just push through the next 48 hours, about children who should not have to think about interest rates or rough men named Victor who call after midnight. And he reached for my shoulder, and I stepped aside, and he let his hand fall, and then he saw the watch on the table through the glass, and his face pinched in a way that told me he recognized a line being drawn, and he said he had meant to get it back, and I said he had not. I spoke carefully, because the climax of a life is not the time for poetry. It is the time for architecture, for beams and angles and load-bearing truths. So I told him without heat that I had created the trust, and that the house and the savings and the pension and the bird bath and the rusty ladder with my name burned into the wood now belonged to a structure he could not lean against, and that my will had been revised, and that any medical decisions he once imagined were his to co-sign were now the concern of professionals who do not drink with him. And he said that sounded cruel. And I said it sounded like oxygen. I slid the letter through the gap in the door as a clerk might pass a form, and he scanned it without reading. And I said, this was the last mercy I could offer. I would call a counselor whose name I had already written on a card. I would pay for the first sessions directly to the office. I would introduce him to a lawyer who specialized in negotiating with men like Victor. I would walk with him to the door of that office the way I had walked him across streets when he was 5, but I would not sign anything, and I would not give him $1 to make a deadline invented by someone who had discovered that my son's fear could be turned into invoices. He laughed then, a short, harsh sound with no boy in it, and he said I had become small and mean, and he said I was hiding behind paper because I did not have the courage to be a father, and he said words about blood and duty and last chances, and then his friend, who had been silent long enough to make silence a form of consent, took one step forward and said in a voice as calm as a knife that maybe I should take a walk with him to the kitchen and have a look at the documents they had brought, because he would hate to see anything happen to this pretty screened enclosure. And he put his knuckles on the mesh and pushed just enough to make the aluminum frame complain. I do not know whether the body remembers a shove as a melody or as an alarm, but mine remembered everything at once. The hand between my shoulders, the lost breath, the laughter that turned my life to a clip, the days spent gathering pieces of myself and arranging them in binders so they would be hard to steal. And I felt the panic rise, and I did not let it crest. I reached for the long pole I keep by the door, the skimmer I have relied on when my body forgets its buoyancy, and I held it, not like a weapon, but like a boundary. And I told them to step back, and I used my old voice, the one from when Michael was 10 and had smashed a neighbor's mailbox with a bat and wanted me to call the owner and pretend it had been wind. And the man in linen laughed and reached for the door handle as if to test whether the lock was metaphorical or real. And when he pulled hard, the frame snapped open and the screen sighed, and they were inside, 2 men among the lights and the wet and the echo, and for a second the world narrowed to the tile under my feet and the pole in my hands, and the old fear crouching by the deep end. I heard the soft chuff of tires from the curb, and Ruth's voice across the hedge saying very distinctly, "You're being recorded." And then Michael lunged, not at me, but at the table where the trust binder lay, which is the kind of mistake you make when you think paper is more fragile than the man who signed it. And I moved to block him, and his shoulder hit mine, and my heel found a patch of water. And in that clumsy choreography of past and present, he stumbled into the edge, skated, windmilled in a parody of my own panic from months ago, and went backward into the pool with a splash that drenched the deck and erased the grin from his friend's face. The skimmer pole was already in my hands, and for a heartbeat I considered the terrible power of pausing, of letting a man feel the shape of the water around his ribs, the way I had felt it, of handing him back that moment when sound becomes bubbles and the body becomes a bell. But I am not a murderer. I am not even an avenger. I am a father who has learned the cruelty of rescue offered on the wrong terms. So I extended the pole and braced my feet and shouted his name, and he grabbed the netting and hung there coughing. And I said loudly, clearly, so the cameras could hear, and the deputy walking through the gate could hear, and the man with the chain could hear, that I would always pull Michael out of water, but I would never again pull him out of debt, not with a signature, not with $1, not with a lie told on a form. And he stared at me with water running from his lashes, and the understanding went through him like a current. And he let me drag him to the shallow steps where he crouched shivering and furious and alive. The deputy, a woman with a neat braid and a voice that kept its promises, asked the man in linen to put his hands where she could see them, and then explained trespass in a tone that contained no poetry at all. And when he began to protest, she turned him gently toward the post, where Ruth's camera and mine and the doorbell across the street had made a small constellation of truth, and the protest died like a candle under a jar. And she asked whether I wished to press charges, and I said I wished to enforce the affidavit already on file, and she nodded and wrote things down. And a second car arrived, and eventually the screen door closed again, and the night reclaimed its own modest drama. I changed Michael into one of my old sweatshirts, while he glared and muttered about betrayal in the cold, and I poured him tea he did not drink. And when he had stopped shaking, I took the watch from the table and placed it back in its box and told him what he already knew, that the trust would not be undone, that the cards with counselors' names would sit on the counter for him to take if he wished, that the deputy would give him a ride, or he could call a friend, that there was no more conversation to have about money or papers or favors, and that if he came back to this house without calling first, I would not open the screen. He asked me then, very quietly, whether his children would hate him if this became public, and I said, children decide their own weather, and parents give them umbrellas or broken promises. And if he wanted an umbrella, he knew where to find one. That did not cost me my life. He left without slamming anything again, and I stood by the pool with the skimmer pole in both hands, and I felt the air return to the house. And I understood that the climax had not been the splash, but the sentence I had spoken into the steam of my own fear. I will not let you drown, but I will not drown with you. And for the first time since the day he pushed me, I believed myself. In the weeks after the patrol car's taillights slid off the curb and the cicadas reclaimed the night, the house settled around me like a coat that finally fit, and what had been emergency began to feel like routine, not the dull routine of old age, but the deliberate ritual of a man rebuilding the rooms inside his ribcage. I had the screen repaired and the lock replaced with a bar the contractor said was commercial grade, and that I thought of as a hinge for my spine. I sat with my lawyer and finished the tedious, merciful paperwork that ties off loose arteries in a life. I froze my credit, changed the codes, and placed the thin gold watch back in its velvet as if I were tucking my marriage in for the night. The deputy called once more to say the trespass warning had been logged and would be honored by any cop who typed my address into a cruiser's terminal. And Ruth brought over a peach cobbler that tasted like apology and victory in equal measure, and when she asked if I planned to press charges, I told her I had chosen the version of justice that lets old men sleep. The channel where my humiliation had briefly paid for beer money went quiet after the arrest report appeared on the man in Linen's public record. Not because guilt was discovered, but because no algorithm enjoys paperwork. And for the first time since, the day of the shove, the blue of the pool looked like water again rather than an argument I was losing. I left a single voicemail for Michael, steady and short, reminding him of the counselor's name and the prepaid sessions, waiting at the front desk, telling him that if he wanted a ride, I would drive him there with the same hands that had once guided his bicycle seat down the hill. He didn't call back, but 2 days later, the clinic left a message confirming his intake, and then a week of silence, and then a second message saying he had missed an appointment. And after that, I asked them to stop updating me because information, like sugar, can rot a man in places he cannot floss. I began to use the pool again in the early mornings when the sky is a pale bruise and the pump speaks in consonants. I moved slow at first, toes on the ledge, then palms on the rail, then a slide into the shallow end where even a coward can stand. And I learned that fear, like grief, does not drown you if you name it before you breathe. My doctor, who has never been impressed by either drama or denial, suggested a water class for cardiac patients at the YMCA, and I went, not because I enjoyed the idea of bobbing among foam noodles, but because humility is cheaper than a funeral, and in that warm rectangle of public water, I let myself be an old man whose knees creak and whose heart sometimes knocks on the wrong door. And I found a strange fellowship in our crooked circle, a half-dozen lives held up by chlorine and modesty. And when I told them I had been pushed, they said little. Men my age recognize a wound by the way it chooses its sentences, but one of them tightened his mouth and showed me a scar from his son's temper that had not involved water, and I understood yet again that what sinks us is never original. The grandchildren's videos faded like a bruise too, replaced by a text from an unfamiliar number that said only, "Are you okay?" with a wrong apostrophe that identified the sender as someone born into glass screens. I wrote back that I was fine and that the house was quieter than a church on Tuesday. And I added that my door would open to any child who knocked alone. And after a long while, a reply came, "Maybe sometime," which in their dialect is a promise big enough to set a chair on the porch and wait. The bank mailed the last fraud affidavit for my signature, and the sheriff's office called to confirm that my statement matched the footage, and the lawyer sent a crisp letter to a man named Victor, whose silence afterward was the closest thing to politeness I expected from him. And in the evenings, I played the old records my wife loved, letting violins remap the air, and found that memory, properly cued, is a solvent that removes certain stains without ruining the fabric. News about Michael arrived sideways, as it always had, a neighbor mentioning a storage unit auction where his name had been printed and then blacked out, a comment from the old pastor that Michael's ex had asked for a number to an attorney who specializes in negotiations with small, energetic lenders. A voicemail I didn't hear until the next day, in which he said he was working a program and keeping his head down and not asking for anything. 3 phrases that together sounded like sobriety scaffolding or a sales pitch to God. I did not return the call because mercy, to be mercy, sometimes needs distance, but I drove by the clinic one Thursday at noon and saw him outside under the eaves smoking, thin and in the way men get when they are shedding bravado, and he looked up, did not wave, and I did not honk, and that was our truce. On the first Sunday of Advent, Ruth talked me into the early service, and I sat in the back as the candles were lit and thought about vows that bind and signatures that sever, and how the same hand can make both kinds of promises. And when we stepped out into the brittle Florida morning, she asked whether I still planned to sell and move nearer to her sister on the Gulf. And I heard myself say that I would keep the house a while longer, not because it was cheaper than grief, but because every window now looked like a place I had chosen to own. I wrote a letter to my grandchildren and put it in the desk without stamps, a long, unfashionable document that said I loved them enough to tell the truth about their father and myself, and that I would pay for any counseling they sought if they made the appointment on their own, and that I would never again fund anyone's denial, not even my own. I sealed it and did not mail it because sometimes readiness is the whole miracle. By spring, the bougainvillea had recovered from the winter trim, and the pool man, who had watched my face more closely since the night of the deputy, began to talk to me like a peer rather than a client, which is how a man knows he has come back into his own yard. And one warm afternoon, I realized I had swum the length of the pool twice without freezing at the memory of falling. And I sat on the steps and laughed into the splash because the body, given half a chance, will teach the mind how to behave. Michael's last message came on a Tuesday when the sky was the color of dishwater and the weather app promised rain that never arrived. He wrote that he was filing bankruptcy and starting over, that he had sold the channel and blocked the bookmakers and unplugged the games, and that he was angry with me every morning and grateful every night, which may be the closest thing to repentance I will ever be offered. And he asked whether, if he stayed sober through summer, I would meet him for coffee at a place where they do not serve beer. And I replied that I would, and that he should bring no documents and make no pitches, and come as a man who has finally learned that rescue is not alone. That evening, after the sprinklers clicked off and the frogs began their simple theology, I walked out to the deep end with the skimmer pole and laid it down along the coping, the aluminum warm from the day, and I understood that the tool, which had once felt like a weapon, had become what it always was, a long hand meant to reach without being pulled, a way to help without stepping in after someone. I am not a hero, and I am not the villain my son's audience wanted. I am an old man who refused to become collateral, who rescued a drowning man once from water and refused to rescue him again from consequences, who will open his screen door to any child who knocks alone and keep it latched against any story that asks me to sign myself away. Some nights I float on my back with my ears under and watch the neighbor's porch light wobble on the surface like a small, faithful moon. And I hear my wife's watch ticking faintly in my memory, the way a metronome marks a practice room. And I repeat the sentence that saved me, because it is worth saying out loud in the hearing of the water. I will not let you drown, but I will not drown with you. And if there is any justice left for men like me, it is simply this: breath in, breath out, a sky you can trust, and a house that knows your name when you put the key in the door.